thank you very much for your attention. And now it's my lovely role to be the moderator of this panel. So I have to bring another set of papers. And as first speaker, I would like to introduce Mădălina Brașoveanu, who is art historian based in Oradea. In 2020, she received a PhD degree from the Faculty of Art, History and Theory, National University of Arts in Bucharest, with a thesis on unconventional art practices within artist collectives in Romania in the 1980s. She researches and writes about Romanian socialist art with a focus on artistic micro-communities, conceptual art, archival, and exhibition studies. She was recipient of research fellowship funded by Getty Foundation, Los Angeles, and New Europe College, Institute for Advanced Studies in Bucharest. And she was member in several collective research projects. Currently, she's assistant professor of art history and theory at Faculty of Arts, University of Oradea. She contributed to several publications, among which are Artists and Agents, Performance Art and the Secret Services, or Invisible Frames, Rhetorics and Experimental Exhibition Practices in Romanian Art between 1965 and 1989. So, Mădălina, the microphone is yours. I hope you open your... Yeah, okay. Yeah, everything's fine.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Well, so in the early months of 1989, the artist Dan Perzhovsky had the initiative of organizing an exhibition dedicated to the poet Mihai Enescu in the Museum of Oradea. An exhibition entitled Poet Poetry, which was open for participation to the artists, members of the local youth organization of the Union of Artists, Atelier 35. 1989 was the year of the centenary of Eminescu's death, and the theme of the national poet offered an opportunity, in Perzhovsky's view, for the young artist to be accepted to exhibit in the city's museum, in the so-called institutional mainstream, under the umbrella of an officially encouraged subject, but with a content they considered alternative by comparison to the visual habitudes of such a mainstream venue. The main material that exists on that exhibition is a video recording from the opening. The artists of the Atelier 35 answered in very small numbers eventually, the exhibition counting a total of 5 or 6 participants, from which I was able to identify only 5 for sure. So among them, Onico Gerendi presented works from the series Tangaj, which can be translated pitch in English as the up and down motion of a boat, which consisted in graphic works on paper that used writing as both verbal and visual element, and which he exhibited on the wall as 2-dimensional works, as well as in 3-dimensional installments as independent objects placed on the floor or suspended in space. Along with the works Tangaj, Gerendi also exhibited photographs documenting an outdoor intervention she made together with Dan Perzhovsky in the vicinity of Oradea at the ruins of a concrete bunker from the Second World War. Entitled Happening, dedicated to Mihai Eminescu and dated 1988, the intervention consisted in Gerendi and Perzhovsky writing repeatedly on the concrete ruin and on a long stripe of paper laid on the field, fragments of Eminescu's lyrics and the text Dor de Eminescu, missing Eminescu. Dorel Găină, another artist in this exhibition, presented an installation placed on the museum's floor consisting of groups of photographs and fragments of torn photographs, which were fixed here and there with pebbles. The images were grouped as thematic collections, showing flying birds, or seashores, or different textures of soil, rocks and surfaces filled with pebbles, feathers, clouds, etc. Dan Perjovski exhibited a large number of works on paper and paper collage in varied formats and dimensions. Some of these works reiterated leitmotifs of his repertoire back then, such as the anthropograms, the little human figures, but most of the works showed more of his engagement in exploring the text as a graphical or visual element, along with unusual formats and ways of presentation. Maria Minkiewicz presented two monochrome drawings with an abstract gestural imagery, very characteristic in style for all her work of the period, and both untitled. And finally, Laszlo Wiparosi showed three etchings entitled Hyperion and Faust, from which I can show you now only the two entitled Faust. Well, and what about this exhibition? The first issue comes from its title, subject, pretext, namely the centenary of the national poet. Mihai Eminescu, a romantic poet with highly conservative and nationalistic views, was one of the central figures used by the dictatorial regime in Romania to legitimize its own nationalistic ideology, which started to be promoted since the early 1970s, when it was also indicated as the only direction the arts and literature should follow. The arts and literature had to be militant and to contribute to the building of a nationalist communist consciousness, which was fed by the glorious past of the motherland and culminated with the regime then in rule. Eminescu's nationalistic, xenophobic, anti-Semitic and anti-Western ideas, together with the example of his work by which, in Constantin Noica's famous words, he established himself as the complete man of the Romanian culture, were actively used by the political power as arguments to enhance the identitarian reinforcement of the new socialist nation. In this context, the speech Perjovski gave at the opening of the exhibition was rather marked by the so-called wooden tongue of the time, and by poetical accents, of course, highlighting the modernity of the artist's approach to the legacy of Eminescu and reproducing some of the most vehiculated quotes regarding the poet. Well, I found this adhesion to the Eminescu's theme as a very problematic one, especially coming from artists such as Dan Perjovski, Dorel Găină, Oni Pogherendi, and Laszlo Wiparosi, who belonged rather to the unconventional local art scene at that time. One would suppose that the Eminescu subject would have been easily perceived by the artist as being an instrument in the use of a nationalistic regime, in a time when the infamous proto-chronist theory was actively propagated and the effigy of the poet was to be found on every one of the media and institutional channels of the official propaganda. Despite all that, for most of the artists in the exhibition, the theme was regarded, it seems, as a clean one, a purely literary reference without any ideological implications. For Perjovski, instead, paying tribute to the national poet through unconventional works and displays had the value of a disguised act of subversion, as he explained to me, and I quote from Perjovski's words. I was working in the museum as a custodian since 1985, and from the very beginning I wanted to mix the institution with the living arts. For this, you shouldn't be mistaken me for a great strategist, nor think I was relying on some institutional theories. None of such things. But by working in the museum while exhibiting with Atelier 35, I thought it was natural that the young artists, meaning myself, should be allowed to show in the museum. It was just one more space to occupy. In the museum, you couldn't enter anyway, so there I came with Eminescu. In fact, the title was a diversion for the censorship. Many of my colleagues and myself were working with text as graphical elements, and it's from here that I drew the reference to poetry and the theme of this exhibition. It was instinctively a battle for power. If the museum certified us, we'd stop being those from the kindergarten. And he goes on. Actually, I didn't care about the theme, as I didn't care about the works either, but I cared about the act, being in the museum, and the form. Torn papers and photos, no frames, works placed on the floor, all things that are revolutions in the Romanian museums even today. Now, when I say political here, and you say political in your text, we are both wrong. It didn't exist political in socialist Romania because the political stage was filled to the brim. It was taken by the party. We had a political naivety, of course, even a blindness. But there's one thing I can guarantee for: there were no nationalists in the group, nor indications given by the party. The party simply didn't exist when we are discussing or making exhibitions, as if we're putting the monster between the brackets and we're done with it. The alternative has to be understood in the context of the salons and homage exhibitions. And finally, in that context, our exhibition was a strategy of subversion of the official discourse, of subversion of the official poet, and of the official museum. The exhibition was made in the museum, that is, in one of the bastions of the dictatorial propaganda. The exhibition introduced in the museum artists and a contemporary visual language that still do not find their place in the same museum 30 years later. The exhibition was an alternative act for the history, the language, and the culture in Romania. I, for one, am very pleased with the result. End of quote. When the political monster is enclosed in brackets in order to be possible to act in a separate sphere from it, but still the character and goal of the enterprise is filled with political value as subversion, you end up with a seemingly paradoxical situation. One of the main sources of such paradox is, I believe, that species of the post-socialist discourse termed by Alexei Yurchak as binary socialism, a perspective very present in art historical writing too, that sees the socialist past by means of coarse categories and distinctions between official and unofficial, founded on discursive reminiscence of the Cold War. The wide use of such terminology established a dualist view upon the recent past, thus being understood as implicit somehow for that context the existence of a clear distinction between the official culture and the culture of opposition, the alternative being part of the last and mostly unofficial. As such, many other forms of demarcation from the official culture, or simply from the political field, or forms of negotiation in the very frames given by the dominant ideology, were either not acknowledged as forms of disagreements, or are now recalled by using a far too steep and radical terminology, such as the term subversion used here by Berjovsky. How can an initiative that was born out of a political naivety, even blindness, be considered by his initiator as subversion, which is a purely political category? How come the vast majority of the art that considered itself alternative was in Romania permitted and sometimes even promoted in the so-called first public sphere and into the museum? The value of the alternative, as the artists understood it, seems rather to have been condensed in the act and the form of the exhibition, both different to some extent from the ones that dominated in similar thematic and discursive conditions. However, the alternative was not evaluated by the artists according to the political implications which the theme and discourse of the exhibition released into the public realm. This shows a way of making exhibitions whose discursive package either ignored or reproduced topoi of the official discursive field, only to present visual results that differed, both from the prescriptions of the party and from the dominant art scene. The binary perspective cannot describe and analyze such relations and cannot explain how and why an exhibition like this, as many other of its kind from that time, managed to achieve their difference, no matter to what degree. As Alexei Yuchak explains when describing the performative shift taking place in the Soviet Union starting with the 1960s, for the citizens it became much more important to take part in reproducing the form of the ritualized acts of the authoritarian discourse than to accept and to operate according to its constitutive dimensions. This reproduction of the form of the ideological discourse confirmed the participant as a normal Soviet person, and it made possible for other diverse, multiple, and unpredictable meanings to arise in the daily life, including meanings different from the constated content of the authoritarian discourse. The normal person is thus distinguished from what Alexei Yuchak calls ideal types, that of the activist and that of the dissident, which both understood the authoritarian discourse in its constated meanings, it as description of reality. This internal shift in the dominant discourse the normal persons produced was different from dissidents and was not articulated in terms of opposition, but was closer, as Yuchak explained, to what Deleuze and Guattari called strategy of deterritorialization. Different processes generated by different systems, entities, but which are mutually constitutive and which modify the nature of each of the entities involved. Of course, it can be justly argued that the political situation of the Soviet Union in the decades following Stalin's death was very different from the Romanian one. If there Stalin, as source of the authoritarian discourse, exited the scene, and Khrushchev initiated the de-Stalinization process with visible effects on the daily life, here, instead, Ceausescu narrowed the freedoms of the liberalization period of the 1960s, starting with the 1970s, and didn't exit the scene as source of the authoritarian discourse until 1989, but instead consolidated his dictatorial position and personal cult. But still, despite all the differences, the performative shift and deterritorialization Yuchak proposed seem to help describe much more appropriately the way the alternative artists active in the late 1980s related to the political system. Even if the exhibition poetry is rather minor in the exhibition economy of that artistic community, and without opening now the discussion about what is major and what is minor in art history, it still manages to reflect in a very contrasting way a certain specificity in the relation between the verbal and the visual discourses of the exhibition, between an art self-identified as alternative, as avant-garde, and the institutional system, between the art scene and the political real, which can all be found in most of the alternative exhibitions of the decade. In all the public events they organized or they took part in, the alternative artists got involved as normal persons, which were rather reproducing performatively the rituals of the official rhetoric, while constantly negotiating their acceptance into the official sphere of culture, only to try to open up this sphere and to add new meanings and new possibilities to it. In this view, the use of some unconventional visual solutions had a certain value of non-alignment, but not directly against the political sphere, as against the dominant artistic one. The alternative has to be understood, as Brzezinski justly claims, in comparison to the salons and the homage exhibition, as being different from the art that dominated in the union of artists and in the cultural mainstream. However, neither the tradition of salons nor the forms of conservative art, which gave the image of the union, were products of the socialist ideology reflected in the field of art. Instead, they both belonged to a bourgeois cultural tradition and the local predilection to conservatism that the socialist system preserved to a certain extent, appropriating them. Without having been directly generated by the socialist system, they had come to represent the extension of the system in the artistic sphere through the institutions of art. This may explain why many artists consider their work was a clear form of dissent against the regime, when in fact it opposed only a dominant conservative line of the local culture. To conclude for now, the claim of subversiveness may be understood rather as an internalized form of dissent correspondent to the internalized censorship widely present in the local culture during the last decades of the socialist rule, if we still need to use the binary theoretical perspective. If instead we admit that this perspective proves to be ineffective in describing those realities and that it produces distortions and misrepresentation, then what other methodologies and theoretical instruments may become useful in distinguishing political subservient art from alternative art, from political neutral art? Should such distinctions still constitute a stake for contemporary art historical writing? If not, what other distinctions may be used to make sense of that very specific, diverse, and elusive art scene of late socialism and its way to blurring meanings? And as a last question, what happens to the art historical valuation grid if it is deprived of the ideal types, dissident and activist artists, and is left to deal with artists as normal people? Thank you.